Please welcome Mr. Michael J. Knowles.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. Thank you. There was a notice. I saw it on Snapchat. There is going to be a big walkout of people who are upset about this discussion tonight. They encouraged people to register here. If you are free Thursday, please consider coming. The plan is as follows. We recommend using an alias and registering as many guests as possible for the event. First, throughout the crowd, be as disruptive as possible, and then at the sound of the phone alarm, stand up and walk out silently. Silently. This will be within 5 to 10 minutes of the talk starting. Please remain silent during the walkout. Not doing so places trans students and other participants at risk. But if they stay, it places them at risk of learning something, which would be very terrible, very. It seems, what was that question? No, you have me to speak. You invited me here to speak about this, which is why I'm giving the lecture. And then when you get invited to a school, you can go to give a lecture about whatever you want. Our topic this evening, men are not women, should be an uncontroversial statement. You would think it'd be like saying the sky is blue.
Trans men are men, trans women are women.
You know how I know that isn't true? The gentleman just said trans men are men and trans women are women. The way I know that isn't true, if men could be women and women could be men, there would be no such thing as either men or women. The categories of man and woman rely entirely. The thing that these people don't realize is that we're streaming this out right now to like 1 million people, so they can be as disruptive as they want in the room, but everyone's hearing it out there. The categories of man and woman rely entirely upon sexual difference, and yet today's transgender ideology insists, shouting over speakers at universities, that men and women are not really different. Today's gender ideology insists that man and woman, male and female, are rooted in, they are not rooted in reality at all. Instead, they are social constructs to be changed at will. The gender activists will sometimes try to draw a distinction between sex and gender. You know, you'll notice they're so afraid of hearing the truth that they have to try to shout because they know that reality is too much for their ridiculous fantasies. You know, I recently spoke. I'll tell you, I can go through their argument here, just said, look into the biology. This is the key to the argument because they insist that gender and biology, gender and sex, are different. The problem is that the people who have biologically male uterus, the people who has a, what? I feel as though I've just been Me Too'd by this person. I'm going to file some sort of suit. Another protester I spoke with in Michigan tried to have it both ways too, tried to say that sex is determined by biology, but you're taking away my personal freedom to give a lecture. Gender, they say, is just something that happens in your mind. This is the point that these cackling hyenas out here are trying to make. And this is the point they're trying to make. We're not cackling hyenas. So this is the point that they're trying to make, which is that gender and sex are different. That gender is something that happens in the mind, and sex is something that happens biologically. That sex is something that is determined by your biology. But if gender is something that happens in the mind, then surely you can simply change your mind. Is that not in fact the case? If something occurs in the mind, you can change it. So if someone is uncomfortable with their gender, and it is simply a social construct, then you can change your mind. At this point, this protester, who was a lot like these people, said that it doesn't just happen in the mind, it happens in the brain. You can't have it both ways. If gender identity is determined by your brain, then it is biological. Now, there's a greater contradiction here, which these people don't want to grant. On the one hand, we're told that gender is entirely socially constructed, that it isn't real, that it isn't intrinsically meaningful. On the other hand, we're told that the people are not born only with certain gender identities, but actually that these gender identities are so important, so significant, so definitive. They think they can out-talk me, they can't. That these poor people who identify as a different gender must inject hormones and undergo expensive surgeries for years and years to mutilate their bodies in the hope that they might in some way begin to resemble the opposite gender. But the two views cannot be simultaneously true. Either sex and gender are socially constructed malleable, and intrinsically insignificant, or they are real, natural, and immutable. But both cannot be true at the same time. So let us imagine for a second that sex and gender really were malleable and socially constructed. The question that these people won't answer is who exactly has the right to define gender? Who exactly has the right to define what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man? Here we see the irreconcilable conflict between feminism and transgenderism, which these people do not want to grant. Feminism is a gender ideology. That's all it is. It makes certain claims about sex and gender, and specifically about womanhood, what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a daughter, what it means to be a single woman. Now, transgenderism is also a gender ideology. An ideology drives people mad, as you might have noticed this evening. Transgenderism also makes claims about sex and gender and womanhood, and those two gender ideologies actually make contradictory claims. Feminism examines what it means to be a woman in light of male oppression. Feminism examines how men over time have exerted power over women through patriarchy. It explores how women can reclaim power from men, social power, political power, and economic power, by recognizing, can you imagine that some people say this ideology is a mental illness? It's so strange. I can't even imagine where they get that crazy idea from. So I don't know. It comes from somewhere, I guess. This claim of feminism comes by recognizing that women can define their own womanhood. Transgenderism broadly also examines what it means to be a woman, but transgenderism does this specifically from the perspective of men, from biological men with Y chromosomes. It examines it and it defines womanhood from men. This is a fundamental difference. In feminism, women define their own identity as separate from men. In transgenderism, men define womanhood as inclusive of men. And transgender's definition of womanhood can be highly offensive to feminists. You'll notice this, because the transgender definition of womanhood is not womanhood at all, but a caricature of womanhood, a cartoon of womanhood. For instance, those people screaming are being very ladylike, aren't they? Very ladylike. For instance, drag queens are not women. Drag queens are caricatures of women. They present a cartoonish, usually overly sexualized view of women as seen through the eyes of men. Now, some feminists, by the way, agree with me and recognize this threat because feminism relies entirely upon sexual difference. If men and women are not naturally and immutably different, then what precisely is the purpose of feminism? I'll get to intersectionalism in a second. Just you wait, my dears. Megan Murphy, the editor of the magazine The Feminist Current, observed the contradiction. And that woman, the editor of The Feminist Current, made one observation that got her kicked off of Twitter because of the shouting, censorious mob like those people out there. And do you know what she said? She said, men aren't women. And she was kicked off of Twitter for that. A feminist editor of a Canadian journal. And Twitter behaved just like all of these hecklers, just like all of these heckler vetoes over here do. Now, if you took a time machine back all the way to the way back, say, about 5 years ago, and you told people that a man would come to a university campus, he would defend the proposition that men are not women, and this would be a hugely controversial event, that person would have laughed in your face. Would have said, Michael, perhaps you would have something else to talk about there. No. But what changed? How did the perfectly obvious statement that men are not women come to be considered hateful? And there are two main culprits to that. The first was mentioned by some person out here earlier, which is the left's embrace of intersectionality. Intersectionality is victim politics on steroids. Victim politics. It posits that layers of oppression combine to form something like a pyramid of victimhood. And where you fall on the victimhood pyramid will dictate your degrees of oppression and privilege. But ironically, in our culture, in our inverted culture, the words oppression and the words privilege now mean the opposite. They've been reversed. So the ability to claim oppression actually carries with it certain social privileges. For instance, if these screaming children in here weren't able to claim some false sense of privilege, they would not only have been ejected from the lecture hall a long time ago, they would have been expelled from the university. They should have been expelled from 10th grade. But because they can claim certain social advantages by ways of a false oppression, they are allowed to sit here and degrade the American university. A privilege, ironically, is a special right, and today, because oppression carries social privileges, a privilege is actually a disadvantage. If you are deemed to have privilege, you are told to shut up, usually by heckling crowds. You are told to check your privilege. You are told that your opinion is invalid. You are told that you do not have the right to speak. You are told that your very identity is wicked, that you are guilty of some great crime. I'll let them exhaust themselves for a second. And so, all social pressure incentivizes people to claim oppression and victimhood and to deny their own privileges. This creates ever-multiplying victim groups, false victim groups like these people. This creates ever-multiplying racial victims. I know, you're so oppressed, my dears. I know, life is so hard for you. You have to live in the richest, most equitable, most just country in the history of the world. You have to get a college education. You have to voluntarily go to lectures. It's so awful. I can't imagine. The people who are in war-torn nations, they must truly pity you. Okay, goodbye. Goodbye then.
So much hate! So much hate! We have every right to exist!
I know, I seem so hateful. You guys seem lovely and sweet. Well, it's very difficult to use my platform when people use the heckler's veto to try to shut up any opinion that disagrees. I didn't think I was this intimidating. That's what happens when you assault people, by the way, folks. That's what happens. They did that because that gentleman threw a bunch of some unknown substance on me. All right, let's continue the lecture, shall we? Thank you very much. Thank you to law enforcement. Thank you very much. We're so hateful, aren't we? We're such violent, hateful people, aren't we? You're just trying to, you're trying to teach me with your fists. Thank you. That's the same lesson that Mussolini was teaching people. You ridiculous fascists. You ridiculous, silly fascists. How is this guy still in this lecture hall? How is this guy still in this university? It is outrageous. By the way, if these people are not expelled from this university, that is a scandal for the University of Missouri. It would be an absolute outrage if these people are not expelled from this university for acts of violence to protest the most common sense statement that I could possibly make, which is that men are not women. Imagine if I said something controversial here tonight. Imagine the reaction then. Goodness gracious.